Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or it's evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Celestine Hargrove stood frozen behind her gleaming black Mercedes, her manicured fingers clutching a shopping bag from Nordstrom so tightly the handles cut into her skin. Her son, Elliot, her precious, perfect 10-year-old boy who attended the most expensive private academy in Seattle, was sitting cross-legged on the filthy sidewalk outside Pike Place Market. But he wasn't alone. Crouched beside him was a homeless boy, maybe 13 or 14, with matted dark hair and clothes that looked like they'd been pulled from a dumpster. The boy was drawing something in the dirt with a stick, and Elliot was watching him like he'd just discovered fire. Celestine's heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be happening, not to her son, not in broad daylight where anyone from her social circle might see. She'd only left Elliot for 7 minutes. 7 minutes to grab the organic sea salt and truffle oil she needed for tonight's dinner party, where 3 board members from her late husband's company would be evaluating whether she deserved to keep her seat as interim CEO. 7 minutes, and her son had found the one person in downtown Seattle she'd rather he never even look at. The homeless boy was speaking now, his voice carrying across the afternoon air with surprising clarity. He was teaching Elliot something about numbers, about patterns, drawing equations in the grime between broken concrete. Celestine wanted to rush forward, to grab Elliot's arm and drag him back to safety, back to the world of marble countertops and Yale preparation courses. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the look on Elliot's face. Pure wonder. The kind of engaged attention she hadn't seen from him in months, not since Marcus died. The homeless boy traced another figure in the dirt, and Elliot laughed. Actually laughed. The sound pierced through Celestine like a blade made of both joy and terror. When had she last heard her son laugh like that? Not the polite chuckle he used at cotillion classes, or the forced smile he gave their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen. This was real. This was the Elliot she thought she'd lost when the drunk driver crashed into Marcus's car 8 months ago. But the boy teaching him was dangerous. He represented everything Celestine had spent her entire life climbing away from. She'd grown up in South Chicago, in a neighborhood where kids like this homeless boy were everywhere, where her own mother had worked 3 jobs just to keep them in a roach-infested studio apartment. Celestine had clawed her way out through scholarships and 80-hour work weeks in a strategic marriage to Marcus Hargrove, whose family name opened doors that someone like her could never touch on her own. Now, here was her son, sitting in the dirt with someone who reminded her of everything she'd left behind, everything she'd promised herself Elliot would never have to know. The homeless boy looked up suddenly, and his eyes met Celestine's across the crowded sidewalk. They were startling eyes, deep brown, clear, intelligent, not the glazed look of someone high or broken. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that made Celestine feel like she was the one being evaluated, like she was the one found wanting. The boy nudged Elliot and pointed toward her. Elliot turned, saw his mother, and his face transformed. The joy drained out of it like water through a sieve, replaced by the careful, controlled expression he wore at home. The mask. Her son stood up quickly, brushing dirt from his expensive khaki pants, mumbling something to the homeless boy that Celestine couldn't hear. As Elliot walked toward her, Celestine made a decision that would change everything. She didn't know it yet, but in the next 10 seconds, she would do something that every single person in her life would call insane. Something that would cost her friendships, reputation, and possibly everything Marcus had left her. She watched Elliot approach, watched the homeless boy gather up the stick he'd been using to teach her son about mathematical sequences. And then, Celestine did the one thing she'd sworn she would never do. The thing that went against every instinct she had developed in her 42 years of life. She stepped forward, past Elliot, straight toward the homeless boy. Her heels clicked against the pavement like a countdown. The boy looked up at her, wary now, already reaching for the torn backpack beside him, ready to run. But Celestine opened her mouth and spoke 3 words that would unravel her entire carefully constructed world. 3 words she couldn't take back. 17 years earlier, Celestine Washington stood in front of her bathroom mirror in that South Chicago studio apartment, pressing a cold washcloth against her split lip. She was 25 years old, working as a junior accountant at a firm that paid her exactly 2/3 what they paid the men with identical qualifications. Her mother, Rosa, was dying of cancer in the only bedroom, and Celestine was sleeping on a futon that smelled like mildew no matter how many times she washed the cover. The split lip was courtesy of Derek Simmons, the manager at her second job, the weekend bartending gig that helped pay for Rosa's medications. He'd tried to corner her in the storage room, and when she'd pushed him away, his ring had caught her mouth. She'd kneed him hard enough that he wouldn't be walking straight for a week, but she'd also lost the job. Lost the $200 a week she desperately needed. Rosa called out from the bedroom, her voice weak and thready. Celestine dropped the washcloth and went to her mother, finding the older woman propped up against pillows that had gone flat from too much use. Rosa's skin had that translucent quality that comes when someone's body is slowly giving up, when cancer has dug in its claws and won't let go. Rosa looked at her daughter's split lip and closed her eyes. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't have to. This wasn't the first time Celestine had come home marked by the world's casual cruelty. Rosa reached out with a trembling hand and touched Celestine's cheek, her fingers cool and papery. She whispered the same thing she always whispered when life knocked Celestine down. Get out. Get out of this place. Don't let this city eat you alive like it ate me. Find someone who can give you the life you deserve. Celestine wanted to argue, wanted to say she'd make it on her own terms, but she was so tired. The next morning, Rosa didn't wake up. Celestine found her mother still propped against those flat pillows, her eyes closed, her chest finally still after months of labored breathing. The apartment was so quiet, Celestine could hear traffic from 3 blocks away, could hear the couple upstairs arguing about money again, could hear her own heart breaking in the silent spaces between sounds. She sat beside her mother's body for 2 hours before calling anyone. She memorized the peaceful expression on Rosa's face, the way the early sunlight came through the grimy window and touched her mother's gray hair. She made promises in that dim room, promises about the life she would build, the security she would create, the world she would climb into where women didn't die from treatable cancer because they couldn't afford decent health insurance, where daughters didn't watch their mothers choose between chemotherapy and rent, where being poor wasn't a slow death sentence. 3 months after Rosa's funeral, Celestine met Marcus Hargrove at a charity gala she'd attended as someone's +1. She'd worn a dress from a consignment shop and shoes that pinched her toes until they bled, but she'd smiled through the pain because that's what she'd learned to do. Marcus was recently divorced, lonely, and attracted to Celestine's intelligence and ambition. He was kind in a distant, distracted way, more interested in his shipping company than in romance. But he offered Celestine something she couldn't refuse, a way out. Not love, not passion, but security. A name that commanded respect, access to a world where she'd never have to choose between medication and groceries. She married him 4 months later in a small ceremony that his family attended with tight smiles and colder eyes. They knew exactly what she was. A climber, an opportunist, someone who didn't belong in their world of old money and older expectations. But Celestine didn't care what they thought. She'd learned that caring about other people's opinions was a luxury she couldn't afford. She worked her way into Marcus's company, proved herself invaluable, earned her MBA at night while managing his household during the day. When Elliot was born 2 years into their marriage, she felt something crack open in her chest, a tenderness she hadn't known she was still capable of feeling. She looked at her son's tiny face and made new promises, different promises. He would never know poverty, never know hunger, never watch someone he loved die because money stood between them and survival. She would give Elliot every advantage, every opportunity, every shield against the cruelty she'd endured. And when Marcus died 8 months ago, leaving her with a company to run and a son to raise and a mountain of people waiting for her to fail, Celestine had doubled down on those promises. She would protect Elliot from everything, even if it meant becoming someone Rosa wouldn't recognize anymore. Teach me too. Those were the 3 words Celestine spoke to the homeless boy outside Pike Place Market, and they hung in the air like a challenge. The boy stared at her with those unsettling brown eyes, clearly trying to determine if she was mocking him. Elliot's mouth fell open in shock. Around them, the afternoon crowd flowed past. Tourists with cameras, locals with coffee, street performers with guitars. Nobody noticed that Celestine Hargrove, widow of Marcus Hargrove, CEO of Hargrove Shipping, was standing in front of a homeless teenager asking to be taught something. The boy's name was Mateo Rivera, though Celestine didn't know that yet. He was 14 years old and had been living on Seattle's streets for 8 months, ever since his mother's boyfriend had made it clear that Mateo's presence was no longer welcome in their apartment. Mateo had a gift for mathematics that his underfunded public school had never properly nurtured, a mind that could see patterns in everything from stock market trends to the way rain fell on pavement. Mateo shifted his weight, his hand tightening on the stick he'd been using to draw equations. He wore 3 shirts layered against the cold. The topmost one advertised a band that had broken up 5 years ago. His jeans had holes in both knees, not the fashionable kind, but the kind that came from actual wear, from sleeping on concrete and running from danger. He studied Celestine with the wariness of someone who'd learned that adults couldn't be trusted. That kindness was usually a trap. But there was something in her face that made him hesitate. Maybe it was the desperation lurking behind her expensive makeup. Maybe it was the way her hands were shaking slightly, like she was as scared of this moment as he was. Mateo made a decision. He crouched back down and started drawing in the dirt again, picking up the mathematical sequence where he'd left off. Celestine looked down at her white silk blouse and cream-colored slacks, designer clothes that cost more than Mateo probably saw in 6 months. Then she lowered herself to the ground beside him, not caring about the dirt or the stares from passing strangers. Elliot watched his mother kneel on the filthy sidewalk like he was witnessing a stranger wear his mother's face. This wasn't the Celestine who insisted on cloth napkins at every meal, who scheduled his entire day in 15-minute increments, who checked his homework with the intensity of a military inspection. This was someone else entirely, someone he didn't recognize but desperately wanted to know. Mateo explained the Fibonacci sequence, how each number was the sum of the 2 before it, how this simple pattern appeared everywhere in nature, in flower petals and spiral galaxies and the curves of seashells. He drew the numbers in the grime: 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. His voice was quiet but confident, the voice of someone who'd taught himself because no one else would. Celestine listened with an attention she usually reserved for board meetings and financial reports. She asked questions, real questions, not the kind adults asked children to fill silence, but genuine inquiries about how the pattern worked, where it appeared, why it mattered. People were starting to notice now. A woman in a yoga outfit pulled out her phone and took a photo. A businessman in a suit stopped and stared, recognition dawning on his face. Celestine saw him see her, saw his confusion, as he tried to reconcile the CEO of Hargrove Shipping with the woman sitting in dirt learning math from a homeless boy. She met his gaze steadily, daring him to comment, and he looked away first. But she knew the photo was already being shared, the whispers already starting. By tonight, everyone in her social circle would know. By tomorrow, the board members coming to her dinner party would have questions. Questions about her judgment, her stability, her fitness to lead Marcus's company. Celestine pushed those thoughts aside and focused on Mateo's stick-scratching patterns in the earth. For the first time in months, maybe years, she wasn't thinking about appearances or expectations or the next item on her perfectly calibrated schedule. She was just learning, just sitting beside her son, just being present in a moment that felt more real than anything in her carefully constructed life. When Mateo finished the lesson, Celestine stood and brushed dirt from her slacks. The fabric was ruined. The stains would never come out. She'd probably have to throw the outfit away. The thought made her smile, a real smile that surprised her. She reached into her purse, and Mateo immediately tensed, ready to refuse money, ready to protect the small dignity he had left. But Celestine didn't pull out her wallet. She pulled out a business card, the kind with her personal cell number on it, the one she only gave to people who mattered. She held it out to Mateo. He stared at it like it might explode. Celestine's voice was steady when she spoke, though her heart was racing. She told him she wanted to hire him, not as charity, as Elliot's tutor. 3 days a week, 2 hours per session, teaching her son the way he'd taught him on this sidewalk. She named a rate that made Mateo's eyes go wide, more than he could make in a month of panhandling, more than enough to rent a room somewhere, to get off the streets. She watched him process the offer, watched hope and suspicion war across his young face. Celestine's house sat in the Highlands, Seattle's most exclusive neighborhood, where homes started at $5 million, and privacy was more valuable than square footage. The dinner party was scheduled for 7 o'clock. At 6:45, Celestine stood in her chef's kitchen watching Mrs. Chen arrange beef Wellington on platinum-rimmed plates while her entire life fell apart in real time. Her phone had been ringing nonstop since this afternoon. 17 missed calls from board members, 23 text messages from friends expressing concern, an email from Vivian Hartford, Marcus's sister, and the company's CFO with the subject line, "We need to talk now." But what made Celestine's hands shake as she poured herself a glass of wine she wouldn't drink was the text from Howard Mackey, the senior board member, the one whose vote she needed most. It contained a single photo, her sitting on the sidewalk with Mateo, and 3 words underneath. "Explain this tonight." She'd known the picture would spread. She just hadn't expected it to detonate quite this fast. Elliot appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in the navy blazer and khakis she'd laid out for him. He'd showered and combed his hair, transforming back into the polished private school boy she'd molded him to be. But something in his eyes had changed. There was a light there, a spark she hadn't seen since Marcus died. He asked if Mateo could really come to their house, if she really meant it about the tutoring. The hope in his voice was so naked, so vulnerable, that Celestine had to look away. She told him yes. She'd meant every word. She'd already called the shelter coordinator to help locate Mateo, had already set up a separate bank account for his tutoring fees, had already cleared space in the library for his sessions with Elliot. She watched her son's face transform with joy, and for just a moment, none of the rest of it mattered. Not the board, not the company, not the carefully constructed reputation she'd built over 17 years of marriage and 8 months of widowhood. The doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock. The first to arrive was Vivian Hartford, Marcus's older sister, a woman who'd made it clear from day one that Celestine would never be good enough for the Hargrove name. Vivian swept into the foyer in a black dress that probably cost more than a small car, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She held up her phone showing the photo, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What were you thinking? Did you have some kind of breakdown? Do you have any idea what the board is saying right now?" Celestine met her sister-in-law's gaze with practiced calm, even as her stomach churned. She explained that she'd hired a tutor for Elliot, a very gifted young man who'd been teaching her son advanced mathematics. The fact that he was experiencing homelessness was irrelevant to his qualifications. Vivian's laugh was cold. "You hired a homeless person to come into your house, around Elliot? Have you completely lost your mind?" Howard Mackey arrived next, along with 2 other board members, Gerald Tinsdale and Patricia Morrison. All 3 wore expressions of barely concealed concern, the kind of concern that really meant judgment. Mrs. Chen served appetizers in the formal dining room, smoked salmon on cucumber rounds and prosciutto-wrapped asparagus, while Celestine felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. The conversation during dinner was excruciating. They talked around the photo for the first course, discussing quarterly earnings and shipping routes, while the real questions hung in the air like smoke. By the time Mrs. Chen brought out the beef Wellington, Howard finally said what everyone was thinking. They were worried about her judgment, about the stress of running the company alone, about whether she was making decisions from a place of stability or grief. Patricia Morrison, who'd always smiled at Celestine at company events, now looked at her with pity. Perhaps Celestine should consider taking a step back. Let Vivian handle more of the day-to-day operations. Focus on Elliot, on healing, on herself. Celestine set down her fork with deliberate precision. She could feel something building inside her, something that had been compressed and controlled for so long It had turned into diamond-hard clarity. She looked at each board member in turn, these people who'd worked with Marcus for decades, who'd barely tolerated her presence in the boardroom. She asked them a question that made the room go silent. When was the last time any of them had actually taught their children something? Not paid someone else to teach them, not scheduled enrichment activities. Actually sat down and transferred knowledge, shared wonder, connected human being to human being? The question hung there, unanswered. Celestine continued, her voice steady. She'd watched Elliot withdraw into himself after Marcus died. Watched him go through the motions of his expensive education without engaging. Today was the first time in 8 months she'd seen him excited about learning. The first time he'd smiled without faking it. And yes, his teacher was a homeless boy. A boy who'd been failed by every system meant to protect him, but who still had the generosity to share what he knew. She would not apologize for recognizing value where they refused to see it. The shelter coordinator found Mateo Rivera 3 days after Celestine's disastrous dinner party, sleeping under the viaduct near Pioneer Square, with his backpack as a pillow and his shoes still on in case he needed to run. The coordinator, a woman named Janet Lee, who'd been doing this work for 15 years, had seen countless kids come through the system. Most were suspicious of anyone offering help. Mateo was no exception. When Janet told him about the tutoring job, about Celestine Hargrove's offer, he asked the same question he asked about every too-good-to-be-true opportunity. What's the catch? Janet didn't have an answer because she didn't know. She'd received some strange requests in her time, but this one was different. The CEO of a major shipping company wanting to hire a homeless teenager to tutor her son. It screamed warning bells. Yet when Janet had called Celestine to verify the offer, the woman's voice had been clear, determined, almost desperate. There was no catch, just the job, just the chance. Janet gave Mateo the address and told him the choice was his. He could show up or not. Either way, she'd be there to help him figure out the next step. Mateo stood at the gates of Celestine's Highlands estate on a Wednesday afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, wearing the cleanest clothes he owned, still worn, still obviously secondhand, but scrubbed in a gas station bathroom until his hands were raw. The house beyond the gate looked like something from a magazine, all stone and glass and perfect landscaping. He'd taken 3 buses to get here, carrying the small backpack that contained everything he owned. 2 changes of clothes, a water-damaged paperback on advanced calculus he'd found in a library donation bin, a photo of his mother from before the boyfriend, and a mechanical pencil he'd shoplifted from a convenience store because proper pencils were tools of learning and therefore justified. The gate opened without him touching anything, responding to some camera system he couldn't see. Mateo walked up the curved driveway, feeling like he was entering enemy territory. Every instinct he'd developed over 8 months of street survival screamed at him to turn around, to run, to not trust this woman or her money or her too-clean house. Celestine opened the front door before he could knock. She wore jeans and a simple blue sweater, no makeup, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked different from the woman on the sidewalk, younger somehow, less armored. She smiled at him, a real smile that reached her eyes and invited him inside. The house was enormous. Mateo tried not to stare at the vaulted ceilings, the marble floors, the chandelier that probably cost more than his mother made in a year, back when she'd still worked steady jobs. Celestine led him to a room she called the library, though it was bigger than any library Mateo had ever seen. 2 walls were covered floor to ceiling with books. A 3rd wall was all windows, overlooking a garden that looked professionally maintained. The 4th wall had a massive whiteboard installed, with fresh markers in a tray and an eraser that still had the price tag on it. Elliot sat at a table in the center of the room, fidgeting with a pencil, watching. Mateo with barely contained excitement. For the first hour, Mateo taught the way he'd taught himself, through patterns and questions rather than memorization and rules. He started with the Fibonacci sequence again, then showed Elliot how it connected to the golden ratio, how that ratio appeared in art and architecture and the proportions of the human body. He drew spirals on the whiteboard that mimicked nautilus shells and galaxies. He asked Elliot questions that made the boy think instead of just recite. What would happen if we changed the starting numbers? Where else might we find this pattern? Why does nature prefer these proportions? Elliot came alive under the questioning. He made connections Mateo hadn't expected, saw patterns in places Mateo hadn't pointed to. The kid was smart, genuinely smart, just bored by whatever his expensive school had been forcing on him. Celestine sat in a chair by the window, ostensibly reading a book, but actually watching them with an intensity that made Mateo's skin prickle. She was evaluating him, he realized, testing whether he was worth the risk she'd taken. At the end of the 2 hours, Celestine handed Mateo an envelope. Inside was $400 in cash, $200 for today's session, $200 as an advance on the next. It was more money than Mateo had held at one time in his entire life. His hands shook as he counted it, unable to fully believe it was real, that she wouldn't snatch it back and laugh at him for being stupid enough to hope. But Celestine didn't take it back. Instead, she asked him a question that made his throat tighten. Where was he staying tonight? Mateo gave her the truth in a voice that tried hard not to sound defensive. Wherever he could find. The viaduct usually. Sometimes the shelter if they had space. Celestine nodded, her face carefully neutral. Then she made him an offer that terrified him more than 8 months of street survival. She had a guest house above the garage, small, just a studio with a bathroom and kitchenette. It sat empty. If Mateo wanted to use it while he was tutoring Elliot, while he was working, it was his. No strings, no catch. Just a place to sleep that had locks and heat and running water. Mateo's first instinct was to refuse, because accepting meant owing her something, meant giving her power over him. But then he thought about sleeping without one eye open, about showering in water that wasn't ice cold, about having a door he could lock against the world. He looked at Celestine's face, searching for the trap, for the angle, for whatever she really wanted from him. All he saw was a woman who looked as scared as he felt, a woman making a leap she didn't fully understand. Mateo heard himself say yes before he could stop the word from forming. Howard Mackey hired a private investigator 2 days after the dinner party. The investigator's name was Raymond Cross, a former FBI agent who specialized in background checks for corporate clients. Howard wanted everything on Mateo Rivera, criminal history, family connections, any red flags that would justify removing this homeless boy from Celestine's house, and more importantly, removing Celestine from her position as CEO. Raymond was thorough. He'd built a career on being thorough. What he found about Mateo Rivera in the first week made him pause. The boy had no criminal record, not even a juvenile citation. His mother, Isabella Rivera, worked as a nursing assistant at Swedish Medical Center. His father was unknown, not listed on the birth certificate. Isabella's boyfriend, Connor Walsh, had filed a restraining order against Mateo 6 months ago, claiming the boy had threatened him. But when Raymond dug deeper, he found hospital records showing Isabella Rivera had been treated for a broken wrist, contusions, and cigarette burns during the same period. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked. Connor Walsh was abusing Isabella. Mateo had tried to protect his mother. Connor had used the legal system to remove the obstacle and kick Mateo out. Raymond followed Mateo for 3 days, documenting his routine. The kid went to the library every morning when it opened, spent hours reading mathematics textbooks that Raymond had to look up to even understand the titles. In the afternoons, Mateo went to Celestine's house, taught Elliot for 2 hours, then returned to the guest house above the garage where he studied more, ate simple meals, and was asleep by 10 o'clock. No drugs, no alcohol, no gang affiliations. The most rebellious thing Raymond observed was Mateo stealing an apple from a grocery store. And even that was done with such obvious hunger and shame that Raymond found himself paying for the apple after the fact and leaving it where Mateo would find it. Raymond was 63 years old. He'd investigated corporate embezzlers, sexual predators, and people running scams so elaborate they'd make your head spin. Mateo Rivera was none of those things. He was just a smart kid who'd been dealt a bad hand and was trying to survive without losing his humanity. Raymond filed his initial report with Howard Mackey and included a note that he rarely added to his professional assessments. Leave this one alone. You won't find what you're looking for. But Howard wasn't satisfied. He wanted ammunition. And if Mateo himself wasn't dirty, maybe Celestine's judgment was. Howard instructed Raymond to expand the investigation, look into Celestine's finances, her relationship with Marcus, anything that suggested instability or impropriety. Raymond did as he was paid to do, though the work left a sour taste in his mouth. What he found about Celestine Washington Hargrove was a story he'd seen before. She'd grown up poor on the south side of Chicago. Her mother, Rosa, had died of cancer shortly before Celestine married Marcus Hargrove. The marriage had raised eyebrows in Seattle's social circles, a nobody from Chicago marrying into old money after a too short courtship. The whispers said she'd trapped him, gotten pregnant on purpose, used sex and manipulation to lock down a meal ticket. But Raymond looked at the facts, not the gossip. Celestine had worked her way through college on scholarships. She'd earned her MBA while raising a toddler and running Marcus's household. She'd started in the company's accounting department and worked up to CFO through demonstrable competence, not nepotism. When Marcus died, she'd stepped into the CEO role because the board couldn't find anyone better qualified. Raymond sat in his office reviewing his findings, and something bothered him. Not about Celestine or Mateo, but about the whole situation. Why was Howard Mackey so determined to find dirt on a woman who was running Hargrove Shipping more efficiently than Marcus ever had? Raymond pulled the company's financial reports from the past 8 months. Under Celestine's leadership, profits were up 17%. 3 new shipping contracts had been signed, including one with a South Korean electronics manufacturer that Marcus had been courting for years without success. Employee satisfaction scores had improved. The company was thriving. So why was the board so eager to push her out? Raymond dug deeper into the board members themselves. Howard Mackey had been Marcus's college roommate and had sat on the board for 30 years. Gerald Tinsdale was Howard's brother-in-law. Patricia Morrison was engaged to Gerald's son. Vivian Hartford was Marcus's sister and held a significant minority stake in the company. They were a tight circle, an insular group that had controlled Hargrove Shipping through family connections and old money for decades. And Celestine was an outsider who'd married in and refused to stay in her place. Raymond found something else in his deep dive, something that made him reach for the phone, despite knowing it would probably cost him his retainer with Howard Mackey. 3 weeks before Marcus Hargrove's car accident, he'd updated his will. The new version left controlling interest in Hargrove Shipping to Celestine, with provisions for Elliot when he turned 25. The previous will had split control between Celestine and Vivian. Marcus had effectively cut his sister out of power. Vivian had contested the will, but the court had upheld it. Marcus's intent was clear, his mental state documented as sound by his attorney. Vivian had lost control of her family's company to the woman she'd never accepted. And Howard Mackey, Gerald Tinsdale, and Patricia Morrison were all friends with Vivian first, board members second. The investigation had never been about protecting Elliot from a homeless boy. It had been about finding a reason, any reason, to declare Celestine unfit and transfer power back to Vivian. Raymond made a decision that went against every professional instinct he'd developed over 30 years in investigation. He called Celestine Hargrove directly and told her to watch her. Back because the knives were already out and coming for her throat. 3 weeks into the tutoring arrangement, Elliot Hargrove stopped sleeping. Not entirely. He still closed his eyes and lay in his bed from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, like his mother's schedule required. But sleep itself had become impossible because every time he drifted off, he dreamed about his father's car crash. In the dreams, Elliot was always in the passenger seat, watching the drunk driver's pickup truck cross the median in slow motion, seeing his father's hands grip the steering wheel, hearing the crunch of metal and the sudden terrible silence that followed. He'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. The dreams had started a month after Marcus died, and never stopped. His mother didn't know. Elliot had become expert at hiding his exhaustion behind the polished smile she wanted to see, at functioning on 3 or 4 hours of broken sleep, at maintaining the perfect grades and perfect behavior that kept Celestine from worrying about him. But Mateo noticed. Of course Mateo noticed. You didn't survive 8 months on the streets without developing an instinct for reading people, for spotting vulnerability, for seeing the truth people tried to hide. On a Thursday afternoon during their 4th week of lessons, Mateo paused mid-equation and asked Elliot directly, When did you last sleep through the night? The question was so unexpected, so precise, that Elliot's careful mask slipped. He stammered something about being fine, about just having a lot of homework. But Mateo wasn't buying it. Mateo set down the marker and turned to face Elliot fully. He spoke in a low voice, too quiet for Celestine to hear from her chair by the window. I know what nightmares look like. I know what running on empty feels like. You can't learn when you're this tired. You can't think straight. Whatever's eating you, it's going to destroy you if you don't let it out. Elliot stared at this homeless boy who had no business being this perceptive, this kind, this willing to see past Elliot's expensive clothes and privileged life to the scared kid underneath. And something cracked open inside him. The same something that had been sealed tight since the day the police came to their door to tell them Marcus was dead. Elliot started crying. Not the quiet, controlled tears he'd shed at his father's funeral while everyone watched. These were ugly, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep in his chest, from a place he'd kept locked because his mother needed him to be strong. Mateo didn't tell him to stop, didn't tell him it would be okay, didn't offer useless platitudes. He just pulled his chair closer and sat there, solid and present, while Elliot fell apart. Celestine was on her feet immediately, moving toward them, but Mateo held up a hand to stop her. "Let him cry it out," Mateo said. "He needs this." Celestine froze, caught between her instinct to protect her son and the recognition that Mateo understood something she didn't. She watched Elliot sob into his hands, watched Mateo sit quiet guard beside him, and felt her own carefully controlled grief start to crack. When Elliot could finally speak, the words tumbled out in a broken rush. He told them about the dreams, about the guilt he felt for being alive when Marcus wasn't, about the pressure to be perfect so his mother wouldn't fall apart too. Mateo listened to all of it without interrupting. When Elliot finished, raw and empty and exhausted, Mateo shared something Celestine had never asked about. Mateo told them about his own father, not the unknown man who'd left Isabella Rivera pregnant and alone, but Connor Walsh, the boyfriend who'd seemed nice at first, who'd moved into their apartment and bought groceries and fixed things that were broken, who'd turned mean when he drank, which was more and more often, who'd started hitting Isabella in places that wouldn't show. Mateo had tried to stop it. He'd called the police twice, but Connor always charmed them, and Isabella always backed his story because she was scared of being alone. The third time Connor hit Isabella, Mateo had grabbed a kitchen knife and told Connor if he ever touched his mother again, Mateo would kill him. He'd meant it. Connor had seen the truth in Mateo's eyes and had called the police himself, claiming Mateo was dangerous, unstable, a threat. The restraining order had been granted. Mateo had been forced to leave. Last he heard, Connor was still living in that apartment, still hurting his mother, and there was nothing Mateo could do about it except survive and hope that someday he'd be strong enough to go back and save her. Celestine sat frozen in her chair, listening to this 14-year-old boy describe violence and helplessness and survival with a matter-of-fact tone that broke her heart. She'd known Mateo was homeless, she'd known he'd had a hard life, but she hadn't let herself imagine the details, hadn't let herself see past the surface to the actual horror of what he'd endured. Elliot looked at Mateo with new eyes, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as the cool homeless kid who knew math, not as the charity case his mother had brought home, but as a real person who'd faced actual monsters and come out the other side still capable of kindness, still willing to teach, still human. Something shifted in that moment, in that library with its walls of books and its whiteboard covered in equations. The three of them, a grieving widow, a traumatized boy, and a homeless teenager, stopped being strangers playing roles and became something else, something that looked almost like a family. Mateo broke the silence with a question for Celestine, his voice careful but direct. "Have you cried yet? For your husband?" Celestine's first instinct was to lie, to maintain the professional composure that had gotten her through 8 months of board meetings and social obligations, and single parenting. But she was tired of lying, tired of performing strength she didn't feel. The truth came out in a whisper. No, not once. Mateo nodded like he'd expected that answer. "Then maybe it's time," he said simply. And Celestine Hargrove, who'd spent 17 years building walls around her emotions, finally let herself feel the full weight of her loss and wept. The emergency board meeting was called for a Monday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, scheduled deliberately while Celestine was supposed to be touring their new shipping facility in Tacoma. Vivian Hartford had planned it that way. Surprise was a tactical advantage. But Raymond Cross, the investigator whose conscience had finally outweighed his paycheck, had called Celestine at 6 in the morning to warn her. "Get to that meeting," he'd said. "They're voting you out today." Celestine canceled the facility tour, dropped Elliot at school early, and walked into the Hargrove shipping boardroom at 8:55, wearing her sharpest navy suit and carrying a briefcase full of ammunition she'd been gathering for 3 weeks. The board members sat around the mahogany table like judges at a trial, their faces arranged in expressions of concern and regret. All except Vivian, who looked satisfied, like a cat who'd finally cornered the mouse. Howard Mackey called the meeting to order and didn't waste time on pleasantries. He laid out their concerns: Celestine's erratic behavior, her questionable judgment in bringing a homeless boy into her home, the distraction from her duties as CEO, the need for stable leadership during a critical growth period. Patricia Morrison presented a motion to remove Celestine as CEO and install Vivian as interim leader while they conducted a proper search for Marcus's replacement. The motion had already been seconded before Celestine even sat down. It was a done deal, choreographed and rehearsed. They'd probably drafted the press release already. Celestine let them finish their performance, let them lay out all their carefully worded concerns about her mental state and her priorities and her fitness for leadership. Then, she opened her briefcase and pulled out 3 folders, setting them on the table with deliberate precision. The first folder contained financial reports showing that under her 8-month tenure, Hargrove Shipping had achieved record profits, secured major new contracts, and expanded into 3 new markets Marcus had been pursuing for years without success. The second folder contained employee satisfaction surveys, showing that morale had improved significantly since she'd taken over, that turnover had dropped, that people actually wanted to work for the company now. The third folder made the room go silent. It contained documentation of every conflict of interest, every questionable decision, every instance of nepotism and financial impropriety that Celestine had uncovered in 3 weeks of digging through company records with the help of a forensic accountant she'd hired personally. Howard Mackey had awarded a lucrative maintenance contract to his cousin's company, despite lower bids from more qualified competitors. Gerald Tinsdale had been using company resources for personal travel and billing it as business expenses. Patricia Morrison had steered a shipping contract to her fiancé's logistics firm without proper disclosure. None of it was technically illegal, but all of it violated the company's ethics policies that Marcus had established. Policies that were still on the books, policies that the board had conveniently ignored because they were all in on it together, one big family looking out for each other. Celestine let them process the implications. Then she spoke, her voice steady and cold. "You want to question my judgment? Fine, let's question yours. You want to remove me because I hired a brilliant young man who happens to be homeless, a kid who's teaching my son more in one afternoon than his expensive private school manages in a week. Meanwhile, you've been running this company like your personal piggy bank, awarding contracts to friends and family, padding expense accounts and hoping nobody would notice because Marcus was too trusting to audit his own board." Vivian's face had gone white. She knew about some of it, had probably participated in some of it, but seeing it documented, seeing the evidence laid out, meant exposure, meant potential legal action, meant the end of the cozy arrangement that had existed for decades. Celestine continued. She had no intention of reporting any of this to the authorities or making it public. She wasn't interested in destroying the company Marcus had built or the people he'd trusted. But she was done pretending that the board's concerns about her were about anything other than power and control. They didn't care about Elliot's welfare or the company's future. They cared about maintaining the status quo where they called the shots and everyone else played their assigned roles. Well, Celestine wasn't playing anymore. She gave them a choice: accept her leadership and clean up their act, or she'd take the documentation public and let the shareholders decide who should be running Hargrove Shipping. The silence in that boardroom was absolute. You could hear the ventilation system humming, hear the traffic on the street 20 floors below, hear hear the collective held breath of people who just realized they'd underestimated their opponent. Howard Mackey recovered first. He tried to bluster, to claim Celestine was bluffing, that she'd destroy her own reputation along with theirs. But Celestine smiled, a cold smile that Marcus would have recognized from the negotiating table. My reputation survived poverty, survived being called a gold digger, survived 8 months of you all waiting for me to fail, she said. I've got nothing left to lose. You, on the other hand, have country club memberships and legacy admissions and social standing that depends on nobody knowing how you've been running this company. So let's vote. Let's see if you really want to remove me, knowing what I'll do if you try. The vote was 4-1 to keep Celestine as CEO. Vivian was the only dissenting vote, her hand raised in defiant anger, even as tears of frustration ran down her carefully made-up face. Celestine gathered her folders, stood, and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back to deliver one final message. The next person who questions my judgment about Mateo Rivera better be prepared to explain why a homeless teenager has more integrity than this entire board combined. Then, she walked out, leaving them sitting in the wreckage of their failed coup, and went to pick up her son from school like nothing had happened. It was 3 a.m. when Celestine's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She woke instantly, the way she'd learned to wake when Elliot was a baby, moving from sleep to full alert in a heartbeat. The voice on the other end was Janet Lee from the shelter, and the words she spoke made Celestine's blood run cold. Mateo's mother, Isabella, had been admitted to Harborview Medical Center an hour ago. Connor Walsh had beaten her so badly this time that neighbors had called 911. Isabella was in surgery now, internal bleeding and a fractured skull. She was asking for her son. The hospital had called the shelter, looking for Mateo's contact information. Janet had given them Celestine's number, hoping she could get the message to him. Celestine was already out of bed, already pulling on clothes, already moving toward the stairs. She woke Elliot quickly, told him only that Mateo's mother was hurt, and they needed to go now. Elliot didn't ask questions. He pulled on shoes and a jacket over his pajamas and followed his mother to the car. The guest house above the garage was dark. Celestine knocked hard enough to wake Mateo from whatever sleep he'd managed to find. He opened the door, confused, still half asleep, and Celestine delivered the news without sugarcoating it, because there was no gentle way to tell someone that their mother might die. Mateo's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: shock, fear, guilt, rage, before settling into a blank mask that scared Celestine more than tears would have. He grabbed his shoes and his backpack, moving with mechanical precision, and climbed into the back of Celestine's Mercedes without a word. The drive to Harborview took 12 minutes through empty Seattle streets. Nobody spoke. Elliot held Mateo's hand in the back seat, a gesture of solidarity that made Celestine's throat tighten. At the hospital, a nurse led them to a surgical waiting room that smelled like disinfectant and despair. A police officer was there, taking notes, asking questions about next of kin and living situations. When he saw Mateo, his expression shifted to recognition. "You're the kid with the restraining order," the officer said. "Against Connor Walsh." "Yeah," the officer's voice gentled. "He's in custody. Assault charges this time, serious ones. He won't be hurting anyone for a long time." Mateo nodded once, his face still that terrible blank mask. A surgeon appeared 2 hours later, still in scrubs, fatigue evident in every line of his body. Isabella Rivera was out of surgery. They'd repaired the internal bleeding and relieved the pressure on her brain. The next 24 hours were critical. She was young, relatively healthy, despite years of poor nutrition and stress. She had a fighting chance, but it was just a chance. The surgeon asked who would be staying with her, who she'd want to see if she woke up. Mateo started to say he would, but the words caught in his throat because he hadn't been allowed to see his mother in 8 months. The restraining order was still active. Legally, he couldn't be in the same room with her. The absurdity of it hit all of them at once. A boy couldn't visit his own mother in the hospital because the man who'd beaten her had manipulated the legal system. Celestine made a decision in that moment that would either save them all or destroy what little stability they'd built. She spoke to the police officer, her voice firm and clear. She had resources, she had money, she had lawyers. Starting right now, she was fighting that restraining order, filing for emergency custody of Mateo Rivera and ensuring that Isabella had the best medical care available, whether she could pay for it or not. The officer looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Celestine Hargrove, CEO of a major company, adopting a homeless teenager and taking responsibility for his mother. It would be complicated, expensive, and public. It would open her up to even more scrutiny from her board and her social circle. It was probably the worst tactical decision she could make right now. Celestine didn't care. She was done making decisions based on appearances and expectations. She looked at Mateo, at this brave, brilliant boy who'd been failed by every system meant to protect him, and she made him a promise. He wouldn't go through this alone. She would fight for him, for his mother, for their right to be a family again, and she wouldn't stop fighting until Connor Walsh paid for what he'd done and Mateo was safe. Mateo's blank mask finally cracked. He turned away, shoulders shaking, trying to hold back the breakdown that had been building for 8 months of survival and fear and loneliness. Elliot moved first, wrapping his arms around Mateo in a fierce hug that said everything words couldn't. Celestine joined them, and the three of them stood in that sterile waiting room holding each other, while hospital staff moved past and machines beeped and the world kept spinning. A nurse approached them carefully. Isabella was awake, asking for her son. The restraining order technically prohibited contact, but the nurse had decided hospital policy about patient welfare trumped court orders. If Mateo wanted to see his shapeless mother, the nurse would make it happen. Mateo wiped his face and stood straighter, trying to pull himself together. Celestine stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be strong right now," she said. "You don't have to be anything but her son. Go be with your mother. We'll be right here when you need us." Mateo nodded and followed the nurse down the corridor toward the ICU, and Celestine sank into a waiting room chair, feeling like she'd just made the most important decision of her life. She had no idea how they'd navigate the legal system, how she'd explain this to the board, how she'd integrate Mateo and eventually Isabella into their lives. She just knew, with absolute certainty, that this was right. That family wasn't about blood or money or social standing. It was about showing up. It was about fighting for the people you loved, even when the world said they weren't worth fighting for. It was about being the person Rosa Washington had raised her to be, before fear and ambition had made her forget. The courtroom was packed on the day Judge Martha Hendricks delivered her ruling on Celestine's petition for guardianship of Mateo Rivera. It had taken 6 months of legal battles, social worker interviews, character assessments, and public scrutiny to get to this moment. The media had covered every step. Seattle CEO takes in homeless teen had been the headline that launched 1,000 think pieces about class, privilege, and the foster care system. Celestine had endured investigations into her finances, her parenting, her motivations. Howard Mackey had tried one last time to use the proceedings as evidence of her instability, but the company's continued strong performance under her leadership had made that argument impossible to sustain. The board had settled into an uneasy truce where they left her alone as long as the profits kept rolling in. Vivian Hartford had stopped speaking to her entirely, which Celestine counted as a blessing. In the gallery, Isabella Rivera sat in a wheelchair, still recovering from her injuries, but alive and getting stronger every day. She'd spent 3 months in the hospital, followed by another 3 in rehabilitation. Connor Walsh was in prison, awaiting trial on attempted murder charges. Isabella had finally filed a protection order herself, had finally found the courage to testify against the man who'd nearly killed her. Celestine had paid for everything: the medical care, the rehabilitation, the legal fees, the small apartment where Isabella was now living with a home health aide. Not because she wanted gratitude or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Because Mateo loved his mother, and Isabella was trying, really trying, to build a life free from violence and fear. Judge Hendricks reviewed the case file one more time, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She'd heard testimony from social workers who praised Mateo's progress in therapy, from teachers who marveled at his academic advancement, from neighbors who'd watched him integrate into Celestine's household. She'd heard concerns about the unconventional arrangement, about whether a single working mother could adequately supervise 2 boys. about whether Celestine's wealth might be creating an unsustainable situation. But the judge had also read Mateo's own statement, written in careful handwriting on notebook paper. In it, Mateo had described what the past 6 months had meant to him, how he'd gone from sleeping under a viaduct to having his own room, how he'd gone from stealing food to eating regular meals, how he'd gone from fearing the future to planning for college, how Celestine had fought for him when nobody else would, how Elliot had become the brother he'd never had, how for the first time in his life, he felt safe. Judge Hendricks removed her glasses and looked directly at Celestine. This was an unusual case, she said. The traditional preference would be for reunification with the biological parent once Isabella was stable. But the judge had to consider Mateo's best interests, not just family preservation. Isabella had made it clear in her own testimony that she wanted what was best for her son, even if that meant sharing custody with Celestine until Isabella was fully back on her feet. Isabella had suffered years of trauma and was still healing. Forcing Mateo back into a household that was barely functional, even with the best intentions, would be a disservice to a young man who'd already been through too much. The judge's ruling was joint guardianship. Mateo would live primarily with Celestine during the school year, with regular visits to Isabella as her health permitted. Over time, as Isabella established stability and completed her trauma therapy, they would reassess. The goal was to keep mother and son connected while giving Mateo the secure environment he needed to thrive. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't traditional, but it was what this particular family needed. The courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions. Isabella was crying, tears of relief and gratitude running down her face. Mateo stood frozen, processing the fact that he now had legal protection, that he couldn't be forced back onto the streets, that he had a future stretching out in front of him. Elliot let out a whoop of joy that made the judge smile despite the formal setting. Celestine felt something release in her chest, some knot of tension she'd been carrying for months. They'd done it. Against all odds, against social expectations, against the people who'd said it was impossible, they'd become a family. After the ruling, they all went back to the Highlands house for a celebration. Mrs. Chen had prepared a feast, not the formal dinner party food Celestine used to serve, but comfort food, the kind of meal you shared with people you loved. Isabella was there in her wheelchair, still weak but smiling. Janet Lee from the shelter came, bringing gifts for both boys. Raymond Cross showed up, uninvited, but welcomed, having appointed himself their unofficial guardian angel. In the library where Mateo had first taught Elliot about Fibonacci sequences 6 months ago, the whiteboard was now covered with college preparation materials. Mateo was testing at a 12th grade level in mathematics despite being 14. Several universities had already expressed interest in his story and his abilities. Elliot had flourished too, his grades improving, his nightmares fading, his smile coming easier. The two boys were brothers now in all but blood, bonded by trauma and healing and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Celestine watched them argue about some mathematical concept she didn't understand, watched them laugh and tease and exist in the easy companionship of people who felt safe together. This was what she'd been fighting for, not just Mateo's future or Elliot's healing, but this moment right here, this feeling of home. As the afternoon wore into evening and their guests began to leave, Mateo pulled Celestine aside. He'd been working on something, he said, a way to say thank you that didn't feel inadequate. He handed her a notebook, its pages filled with mathematical proofs and calculations she couldn't follow. At the end, written in his careful handwriting, was an explanation. He'd created a mathematical model for optimal shipping routes based on weather patterns, fuel costs, and port availability. He'd tested it against Hargrove Shipping's current routes and found potential savings of 8% annually. It was his gift to her, his way of contributing to the family that had saved him. Celestine looked at this brilliant boy, this survivor, this young man who'd taken the worst life could throw at him and turned it into something beautiful. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, terrified and alone, trying to protect her son from a world that felt dangerous and uncontrollable. She'd thought safety meant isolation, meant building walls high enough to keep out anything that might hurt them. But Mateo had taught her something different. Real safety came from connection, from letting people in, from fighting for each other, from building a family not on blood or money, but on choice and courage and love that showed up every day, even when it was hard. She pulled Mateo into a hug, this boy who'd changed everything, and whispered the words she'd been wanting to say for months. "Welcome home, son." And Mateo Rivera, who'd spent 8 months sleeping under viaducts and 3 years watching his mother get beaten and 14 years wondering if anyone would ever fight for him, finally believed that he belonged somewhere, that he was wanted, that he was loved. The millionaire had seen the homeless boy teaching her son, and what she'd done next had shocked everyone, including herself. She'd chosen love over fear, connection over isolation, family over appearances. And in doing so, she'd saved not just Mateo, but Elliot and ultimately herself. Sometimes the people we're meant to save end up saving us right back. If this story moved you, drop a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one.